Our last talk today is Georgios Tsagdis, currently working at the University of Westminster in London, and the title is Fossil and Trace, the Time of Nature.
Natura conservat omnia, nature preserves all. Deus conservat omnia is the inscription of the Sheremete family coat of arms, and of such importance, as I learned today, to Anna Akhmatova. For reasons that will hopefully become clear, God is replaced here with nature. So let me express, first of all, the most heartfelt thanks to Oksana and Artemi for putting this rare panel together, convening here this discussion on the move beyond ecology, which now bears the name of natural powers. So we've been given a great opportunity to open the questions of ecology, of the oikos, as Oksana was saying earlier, the home and prime locus of hospitality, as well as logos, the plural discourse that attempts to think our singular abode, and the tropes of our dwelling in it. Having listened with all of you to the talks of Artemi, Darin, and Michelle, and Michael again, and Oksana, they're pregnant with theoretical and practical insight and a lot of politics in their truest indissolubility. I will try to strike a new balance of those two tropes of thought, thinking with regard to thought's own suppositions and thinking with regard to thought's exteriority, the outside, which here, as always, presents itself at first and perhaps also ultimately as nature. Indeed, the question of exteriority is nothing but the central concern and horizon from which both the fossil and the trace proceed. Before I turn, however, to the two words announced in the title of this talk, words of Quentin Meillassoux and Jacques Derrida, respectively, allow me to begin at some length with the words of another, a unique figure of nature, someone whose significance, like all true significance, is yet to come, in a tragicomic fashion, not unlike that of the passage at hand. So we read in the early pages of Michel Serres' Biogia. He turned around with his back to the sea. Our homeland stretched to the horizon in front of us, a broad, cheerful, and hollow dome. As far as the eyes could see, plowed fields, cherry orchards, meadows for sheep, adobe structures for families, metal sheds for tools, wooden barns for livestock. A happy country, isn't it? He said. I gave my approval with my brow. To enjoy such view here, you see that we've perched on the ridge of a kind of partition, on a thin and long crest that protects our basin from the waters of the sea. What would happen if it broke? Now, ever since my youth, my grandfather often took me here and told me that his great-grandfather had told him that, ever since his youth, the water has been rising. Yes, for as long as the family memory has been passed on, its level has been continuously rising. Measured beneath your feet, the sea now reaches to the brim. I had you come here for a second reason. There is a new one, an event that none of these old traditions tell of, taking place for some months. That noisy here, you might think, wouldn't you, that it's a rumbling similar to the beginnings of an earthquake, never spoken of, nor heard. Nothing about it in any narrative. Yet listen to it well. I've been listening to it for 7 years. You hear it too, I see. It hasn't stopped growing since I've been coming here. What is it saying? Does it have meaning? Who is speaking? Can we understand its meaning? Will I one day be able to decipher this call from the earth? Listen to its voice. Our earth is speaking, you feel it. It's recounting something to us the way your mother did, evenings when you were unable to sleep. It's saying what it knows. What? Who is it speaking to? I've been studying it for years. This voice, I don't dare speak about it to anyone, since in the village everyone takes me for a fool, a visionary, a mystic, a bad citizen who takes no interest in political affairs. Nevertheless, here's my translation of its rumbling. It's announcing that the wall is cracking and is going to collapse. Yes, the one on which uneasy we've perched. I have a feeling its panel is going to fall down. And later, that's why, with my trembling old man's hands, I'm attempting to build a boat, a madman's ship on dry land. And I'm stacking up in its holds, as in a strong box, everything that could be of use in an event of danger. And then later, over long months, he no longer spoke to me, stricken by the melancholy that I neither believed in nor I understood the predictions he claimed to be scientific. It is a strange story, a story pressing against the dam that keeps the flood of literature from philosophy, a story of prophecy at the threshold. Does this story, like its hero, come before or after science, with or against, inside or outside? Is this old man a memory of Sir's adolescence, or Noah, the patriarch of the collective memory of mankind? Is the story coming from the immemorial past or the incalculable future? It is a story unable and unwilling to answer for itself. Rather, it traces the contours of its questions in order to think the trace of nature. One is reminded of Kafka's Bau, or building, usually rendered in English as barrow, a short story surviving only in a truncated, unfinished form, where a mole-like creature has built an underground, insular shelter from the world. Yet outside noises unsettle the creature that is at once homo faber and animal rationalis, sounds that were at times imperceptible, perhaps imaginary. In response, the creature interprets the sounds and noises, trying to calculate the inevitable approach of a menacing, unnameable enemy. The same fear governs our old man, who toils to construct an edifice against catastrophe, hearkening instead of an outside, the inside sounds of the earth's bowels, where Kafka's creature resides. The old man and the mole are equally determined by an audible trace that they cannot determine. Their existence is permeated through and through by the hidden meaning of this trace. Neither for Kafka nor for Ser is the trace static, whereas for the former noises oscillate inconclusively between perceptibility and silence, for the latter the sibyllic voice of the earth grows ever louder until the day of rapture. And we? How do we think the trace of nature and the fossil? How do we think now? I turn first to the fossil, or the archefossil in Meillassoux' precise formulation. I know Michael was talking about Meillassoux a few days ago, the significance of which will soon be clear. Meillassoux calls ancestral any reality that precedes the emergence of humanity and life in general. Accordingly, while a fossil is a material bearing and indicating traces of the prehistoric life, that is, a fossil, bearing and indicating traces of prehistoric life, the archefossil is a material indicating trace of ancestral phenomenon anterior even, and this even is important, even to the emergence of life, such as the radioactively decaying isotope or a remote luminescent star that informs us of its age. In effect, already from the outset, Meillassoux' archefossils are not fossils at all, insofar as the fossil is the remain of life, and thus the remain of a time of life. The archefossil's claim to ancestrality means an exclusion of life, that is, past, present, and future life. Certainly for Meillassoux, this exclusion is not a problem, but part of the proposed solution that the archefossil seeks. Yet already in this exclusion of all possible life, the fossil appears not as a concrete materiality, but rather as an abstract trope of thought. The reduction of the fossil to a mere trope constitutes the crux of the difficulty, at least in one of its possible formulations. For even though the archefossil is instantiated in isotopes and stars, it soon becomes clear that the loans from science are no more than instantiations of a certain logic. Meillassoux presents the introduction of new scientific techniques and technologies since the 1930s as the possibility of an absolute dating, a dating that does not depend on comparing fossils to each other to establish a relative chronology, but knows the exact temporal distance of each fossil from the present through the materiality of the fossil itself. Accordingly, one can calculate the creation of the universe, our galaxy, life, and mankind in absolute terms, that is, in years or other units, as opposed to arranging events in their relative succession in order to estimate their age. A series of questions ensues immediately, 4 of which I only wish to trace here for another future reflection in the hope that the significance will become clearer in the course of this talk. A further 2 will lead us deeper into the present examination. So first, it is important that the fossil is never given in isolation, but in principle needs to be reflected in a certain otherness, radioactivity, the electromagnetic spectrum, and so on, which means that science is never dealing with the fossil itself, or almost never perhaps, never dealing with the fossil itself, but with a trace of the fossil, the trace of the trace. Second, the materiality of scientific technology presents an element that cannot be overlooked. The retort appears trite, but the question of the correlation of object and instrument, and thus technology, is no less fundamental than that of object and subject, yet is left intentionally at the margins of Meyasu. Third, the creation of the archifossil from the fossil seems to have taken place in the 1930s, and also to be still ongoing in the constant revisions of this precise, or less precise, yet all the same absolute dating. Meyasu sidelines Kuhn's logic of scientific discovery, arguing that it does injustice to the intentions of the scientist who does not believe to be merely fabulating, but rather discovering the actual origin of the earth. And I quote here, "An ancestral statement only has sense if its literal sense is also its ultimate sense." And yet, if we have learned anything from the masters of suspicion, that is Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, if not already from the Hegelian cunning of reason, it is that it's the necessary truth that animates our undertakings might no more and no less be a spectre. And finally, fourth, the unidirectional linearity of this absolute chronology, about which theoretical science itself is far from unanimous, is assumed without reserve. And I quote, "It's just a line. It's just a line. That's time." Which brings us to the 2 interconnected concerns that are of immediate relevance to the present examination. On the one hand, Meyasu is forced to reduce absolute dating to a sequence in universal time. Meyasu's own argument will strive to show that universal time is not absolute, since neither the universe as it is, nor its laws are absolute, but rather radically contingent. Accordingly, with regard to absolute time, Meyasu is not only going against his own employment of the term absolute, but against the intentions and explicit declarations of science in the name of which he writes, and tries to vindicate against philosophy. On the other hand, and this returns us to the original problem of the archifossil as a mere trope, Meyasu not only remains indifferent to the life of the fossil, but altogether to the life of science. Eventually, the archifossil is made into an abstract sign, a sign that refers not only to ancestrality, but to every discrepancy of being and thought, before as well as after human consciousness. This discrepancy Meyasu calls diachronicity, and keeps insisting that it is a possibility that was rendered meaningful by the very inception of modern science. And yet, diachronicity, like ancestrality, is not a spatio-temporal and thus in any sense potentially empirical, but a purely logical notion. The archifossil is for Meyasu a stratagem to raise a speculative question, namely the question of the relation of being and thought. Meyasu, by pointing to the existence of the archifossil before and potentially after human consciousness, seeks to revise the correlation of being and thought, or the given and givenness that all of post-Kantian philosophy has been bound to in different ways. The archifossil is accordingly made into the sign of something that is not relative to us, something given as indifferent to its own givenness to be what it is, existing in itself regardless of whether we are thinking of it or not. That's what he says. That's archifossil, indifferent to us. The archifossil is made, therefore, into the talisman of the outside. The post-Kantian necessary correlation of being and thought that Meyasu, with an analytical penchant for isms, calls correlationism, is the true object, That's a true object, correlationism. In his now published talk, Time Without Becoming, Meillassoux summarizes further numerous of the themes of After Finitude, his seminal work. We hear him say at the outset, "My goal is very simple. I attempt to refute every form of correlationism, which is to say that I try to demonstrate that thinking, under very special conditions, can access reality as it is in itself, independently of any subjectivity." And then, in the space of a few pages, he says, "What is very important for me is that I don't pretend to refute correlationism by means of ancestrality. The problem of ancestrality is not at all intended as a refutation of correlationism. This would be naive. In fact, in the first chapter of After Finitude, I simply try to lay out an aporia rather than a refutation." So he says, my aim is simple, I try to refute, and then he says, no, it's not a refutation, it's an aporia. Right? The contradictory statements point to the real crux of Meillassoux' project, which we cannot examine here exhaustively, let alone with any sufficiency. We proceed thus by tracing a work that is yet to be undertaken. Peter Grattan presents Meillassoux' aspiration in the most heroic articulation. Meillassoux contends to have pierced the veil of the phenomenal to a necessary and eternal condition of the an sich, that is, the radical and unassimilable exteriority of the real, as through and through, sine ratione and sine causa. At stake is nothing less than the absolute. Accordingly, the correlation of being and thought that either denied the possibility of this access in the form of what Meillassoux calls strong correlationism, including, among other positions, phenomenology, analytical philosophy, and post-war French philosophy, or made the correlation itself. So the one position is strong correlationism, which denies access to the absolute, and then the correlation itself becomes an absolute in the form of speculative idealism. So he says that we need to show that there is a further possibility. Minds of Kant a little bit. The correlation necessarily subsists, something, and this is something we cannot disregard in order to revert to pre-Kantian speculation. Yet within this correlation, Meillassoux claims to have discovered a path beyond the mutual bondage of being and thought to the great outdoors, as you were saying, the grand dehors of the absolute. Meillassoux is thus the anti-Parmenidean thinker par excellence. Not only are thought and being not identical, but their correlation is neither definitive nor necessary. Certainly, being, which for Meillassoux assumes the form of the universe with its laws and temporality, is not tantamount to the absolute. The universe is not the absolute. Further, insofar as the absolute is to be gained, this can only be done through thought. The call for the correlation of thought and the absolute, a project that Meillassoux shares with Badiou, is the true intention of After Finitude. An intention summed up in the name of speculation. So the archifossil, and accordingly ancestrality, is intended to provide an element of realism, so that speculation does neither relapse to dogmatism nor stray into idealism. The archifossil is presented as an argument against correlationism, even if to pretend to succeed in this assault is naive. Rather, the archifossil is said to work as an aporia against correlationism. I fear that it doesn't do even this. Rather, the archifossil offers the veneer of realism, seemingly siding with science, when in fact it is only intended to advance a logical argument that can hardly survive its own strength. Grattan concludes that Meillassoux does not escape correlationism, but is prepared to accept Meillassoux' moderated claim of succeeding in formulating the aporias that constitute it. And yet he goes on to present the common and blatant objection to Meillassoux' argument. Quote, to make his claim, Meillassoux needs to depict the correlationist as conflating epistemological givenness and the ontological dependence of realities, of real entities, on thought. In effect, whereas for the scientist it is a given, that the universe is 13.82 billion years old, the correlationist is meant to retort that this is only a given for us, humans, who are able to know this. What is given depends on its givenness, which is tied in turn to consciousness. But no correlationist would ever attribute the cause of existence of the material or intelligible universe to human consciousness. Even Berkeley could at most only claim that the question of ontology has no meaning outside epistemology. This position, however, that resurfaces in different guises in Meyer's argument, is neither a rejection of the possibility of the in itself, nor of the correlationist's ontological creatio ex nihilo or ex intellectu of the in itself. Then what are the aporias of correlationism that Meillassoux achieves to expose? Is his attack perhaps no more than a quixotic tilting at windmills? The concern becomes most pressing with regard to religion. Examining the imaginary correlationist in toto, Meillassoux shies only short from accusing directly all correlationists of religious obscurantism and fanaticism, but attributes clearly the resurgence and currency of both obscurantism and fanaticism to the skeptical-fideistic nature of correlationism, as he calls it. The witch-hunting accusation is not only socio-anthropologically, but also philosophically deeply problematic. On the one hand, it refers tacitly to the Hegelian premise that history amounts to the history of spirit, or in another formulation, that the history of philosophy is the philosophy of history. On the other hand, even if correlationism could be accepted as a summary of post-Kantian philosophy, it cannot be taken as a summary reiteration of the religious. Certainly, contemporary philosophy has not forgotten about the religious and the question of God and gods. And yet, with Grattan, we must certainly ask, is Nietzsche's death of God a call for the renewal of faith? Is Heidegger's critique of ontotheology a license for theological hermeneutics? Is difference another name for God? Again, we must defer these questions and return to the fossil. My concern in the preceding is hopefully clearer now. Despite appearances, Meillassoux champions neither the fossil, nor the archifossil, nor against science altogether. His realist rhetoric is a vehicle in his quest for the absolute. Science operates here as the waves that wash away the face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. That's Foucault. And first the face of man, then the face of nature, ultimately the face of science itself. It is a project not of uncovering, discovering, or recovering traces, but of obliterating them. What Heidegger called escaped, the giving and givenness of being, becomes for Meillassoux facticity. Facticity is absolutely contingent for Meillassoux. It is through and through disenchanted. Contingent facticity, I don't know why the word disenchanted here, but contingent facticity is a path that must be left behind as quickly as possible on the way to the necessity of the absolute. What is then the absolute? In the briefest formulation, it is the sole necessary fact of the radical contingency of any other fact. As such, it is the necessary mathematical articulation of all that is possible, that is, all that is mathematizable. An articulation, however, that does not amount to totality, but remains open-ended. So that's the absolute. It is at once a grand and tantalizing view. Its implications are radical. We hear the words of Meillassoux. There is no reason for anything to be, or remain thus, and so, rather than otherwise. And this applies as much to the laws that govern the world as to the things of the world. And again, our claim is that it is possible to sincerely maintain that objects could actually, and for no reason whatsoever, behave in the most erratic fashion, without having to modify our usual relation to things. What is quite strange is that we are implicated in this radical transformation, in the mode, however, of indifference. The world could change beyond recognition, but we would need not follow or respond. Our relation to things and to the transformed world would not change. Should the world turn inside out, we would still go about in our regular dealings. Clearly, the question is, who are we? Who could retain his relation to things unmodified when not even a trace of those things is left? We, that is, each one of us as an I, is res cogitans, a thinker of the mathematical absolute, and therefore rex cogitans, an impervious sovereign, untouched by the fate of being. Seeking a great outdoors, we have discovered an even greater indoors, and the new correlation of thought and the absolute. The first question a mystic would address to Meillassoux, someone perhaps like Dionysius the Areopagite, would be, how can you be certain that mathematics or anything in your thought is in any way commensurate with the absolute? What guarantee is there that thought, rather than being contingent like being, is necessary and thus necessarily indestructible as well as unrelated, severed, absolved with a single stroke from both being and contingency and thus absolute? Is it enough to have made being contingent to make thought necessary? You've made being contingent. Does that make thought necessary? We must keep examining the implications of the work of Meillassoux, a work that announces itself at once as manifesto and fulfillment, evangelism and incarnation of a speculative economy yet to unfold. Perhaps, however, with the intention no less of keeping the fossil alive, we should turn to the work of a correlationist to discover the genealogy of the archifossil. Meillassoux does not derive the logical operator of the archifossil from biology, but, albeit without acknowledgement, from the Derridian architrace. Like the fossil, the semantic logic of the trace disrupts the unity postulated by the Saussurean sign, opening the latter to an exteriority. The trace unsettles the metaphysical determination of the sign, the correlation of the dyad of sign and signified. By virtue of the trace, signifiers always simultaneously differ and differ from the elusive signified, opening up the field of difference. The trace informs us thus that there is something that comes before the sign and persists as a remainder after its constitution. Like the fossil is intended to precede and outlast the givenness of consciousness. Yet while the fossil wishes to be absorbed into an absolute, the trace remains connected and operative in what comes after the origin of the trace, after the arche of the sign. In its withdrawal, the trace persists in the phenomena that follow upon it. If we then look closer to see the trace proceeding with regard we see the trace proceeding with regard to two exteriorities. On the one hand, the exteriority of the sign, which in any sensible and spatio-temporal form does not suffice to generate or constitute the trace, that is, the movement of signification. On the other hand, the trace opens itself to the outside of the sign, that is, the outside of the outside. This opening is not merely effectuated by the trace, as though by a certain substance or agent, but is the very production of the trace, an exteriority at once. Derrida calls it in grammatology spacing, a word we can only think against the background of the Platonic chora, to which the homonymous essay in the collection On the Name returns, Derrida's On the Name. Then again, in Spitz and Phenomena, I'm drawing closer to an end myself, in Spitz and Phenomena, this spacing assumes the form of a dislocation and displacement in which presence through the trace refers beyond itself. Okay? Returning to grammatology, we also see clearly that the structural position the architrace reserves for correlationism, the architrace designates as presence. And I quote Derrida here, all dualisms, all theories of the immortality of the soul or of the spirit, as well as all monisms, spiritualist or materialist, dialectical or vulgar, are the unique theme of a metaphysics whose entire history was compelled to strive toward the reduction of the trace. The subordination of the trace to the full presence summed up in the logos, the humbling of writing beneath a speech dreaming its plenitude, such are the gestures required by an ontotheology determining the archaeological and eschatological meaning of being as presence, as parousia, as life without difference, another name for death, historical metonymy, where God's name holds death in check. The trace breaks with presence. The trace breaks with presence. The trace itself does not exist, says Derrida. The trace is nothing, I quote him again. It is not an entity. It exceeds the question, what is, and constantly makes it possible. Here, one may no longer trust even the opposition of fact and principle, which, in all its metaphysical, ontological, and transcendental forms, has always functioned within the system of what is. Fact and principle, facticity and the law of the universe. Everything is already here. Certainly, the critique of presence in Derrida's work is now a topos. Everybody knows about the critique of presence. What I have rather tried to show in the preceding is the integral place of the trace in this critique, even as this role will be later assumed by words such as the pharmacon and the spectre. Meillassoux remains oblivious to this critique of presence, even when he borrows the trace or fossil as a tool to break to the absolute outside. Even if it is certain that Meillassoux prefers to think according to potentiality and actuality, it remains unclear how the absolute stands with regard to presence and absence. For now, perhaps a few final thoughts on the nature of time might cast a certain light no less to the fossil and trace than to the time of nature. For Meillassoux, the time of consciousness is enveloped by the time that the archifossil as trace signifies. This time is in turn enveloped by the time of the absolute, which Meillassoux does not examine, but which we are invited to think as a time beyond time, a time without time, and a time that gives time. We are certainly not told whether the time of the absolute is distinct from the latter, or whether it is in any sense singular or plural. Certainly, if the absolute is, quote, capable of a lawless destruction of every law, it must also be possible to revise every temporality, so that the fossil should announce no more a past than a future or a present. In this, Meillassoux' work is balancing on a thread above the abyss of skepticism, I reckon. Instead, I invite us to look into the very abyss of time. From this experience, we proceed to read in Writing and Difference. Quote, if nothing has preceded repetition, if no present has kept watch over the praise, if, after a fashion, it is the void which re-empties itself and marks itself with imprints, then the time of writing no longer follows the line of modified present tenses. What is to come is not a future present, yesterday is not a past present. The beyond of the closure of the book is neither to be awaited nor to be refound. It is there, but out there, beyond, within repetition, but eluding us there. Only in this time in which the past, the future, and even the present are not reduced to mere presence can we find the now. Not the now of a dimensionless dimension, the now of the instant, but the deep now of the event that affords the possibility of every relation. This now is the time of nature that is never still, never a nunc stans, but always now anew, calling us to respond to our responsibility. We turn thus to Serre, who, at the end of the Biogia, calls for a new alliance and, quote, a new time for our friends, Eddies and Rito Nobis, to allow us to consider the other, wholly other, the other humans, but also every being in the Biogia, neither as rivals in a race that the human animals wins at the moment, but is going to end by losing, not as enemies in battle, but as symbionts or mutualists. No more war to the death, rather exchanges of reciprocal services. In this new time, and here I quote Sir one last time, in this new time, a certain after flows back and again becomes the before. The outside enters and becomes the in, that in turn and partially goes out. So through and across the fleeing flow I can, a little, hold in my hand the time of now. It is not so mysterious. It is not so impossible then that the against come back as with or as for.